Music surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. That's a quote by the great Alec Guinness. I may have substituted music for the Force, and that might have been in Star Wars, but hey, now that I have your attention, let's talk about music. Music is vocal and or instrumental sounds combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion according to Google. In order to express this beauty, there are certain elements you need to use in order to create your composition. Take for instance this song, right here by Keys and Crates and Crane. You need the drum, vocals, bass, and synthesizer. Without all the different sounds blending together, this song could sound completely different, unfinished, or not even like a song at all. Now, this electronic music is generated for the most part through drum machines, synthesizers, and digital audio workspaces, but it took a long way to get to this point. In this podcast, we are going to be looking at some of the ways early African music has influenced a few different genres through the decades. But first, a little history. Early African music comes from all the way back in the 14th and 15th century. Archaeologists have found cave art and actual remains of instruments used way back in the day. These instruments included iron bells, drums, and even horns. As African peoples began to migrate to different parts of the country, they brought their musical instruments and styles along with them. An example would be the single and double iron bells, starting in northern Africa and then spreading to more of Central Africa and Zimbabwe with the Bantu people. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the likembe, a small iron keyed box instrument, swept over the Congo, and its popularity continued to grow into the 20th century when new models were made entirely out of metal came to the forefront. As Europeans started to explore Africa and its native people, they found that most of the music the Africans were creating was for religious purposes and storytelling. The music was the perfect accompaniment for a sermon, and as Africans began to adopt Christianity in the 19th century, they adapted their musical accompaniment with secular songs and hymns. So now that you have a little bit of background, let's look at jazz. Africans used music back in the day as a sort of communication while working, playing, and practicing religious activities. Most of this music was not written down, so each piece was passed down orally from generation to generation. As the heritage and stories continued, the African slaves started to arrive in America on slave ships. The slaves unintentionally created a new form of music, a blend between the oral tradition and the struggles they were going through as people owned by white men. These new pieces were work songs and created a special form of communication for the plantation workers. The slaves would use call and response music to get through the workday and field haulers to talk back and forth without actually speaking words, since that wasn't allowed by the slave owners.
Oh, when I come to die. And way on the other side, there's a response. Whoa, when I come to die. And up in the third corner is a repetition. Then they all sing together. Give me Jesus.
That's Reverend Cecil Murray, who leads at the First AME Church. On Sundays, the slaves could gather in a field known as Congo Square and share their music with each other. And thus, jazz was born. Now let's jump into a jazz technique we just kind of talked about a little bit, specifically call and response. Reggie Thomas and Alvin Atkinson show us this as their instruments communicate back and forth in their rendition of Duke Ellington's Perdido. So you hear the instruments when it comes to jazz, but what about the vocal call and response? Well, that leads us into our next genre, gospel music. Now, African music has always been somewhat religiously driven, but as the Christian faith began to intertwine its way into African culture, gospel music began to take form as a way to express your faith in God. Dr. Iona Locke tells us more about the correlation.
So one of the things that we have to always remember is that the work of the gospel and the song of the gospel are a complete compliance together. We have to remember that gospel music is a complete composite of who we are as people once we've been called Christians.
These gospel hymns told stories about the Bible while still maintaining the call and response specific rhythm. The Africans also contributed stylized drum patterns and rhythms with this style of music. Thomas Dorsey, an African American known as the father of gospel music, added a main piece to what church music was missing up until the 1930s, a piano. This is Dorsey talking about his switch from blues music to gospel music.
I started to work in blues because they were something that the people loved. But most of the people who took that were not Christian people. And I was doing all right for myself. But the voice of God whispered, says you need to change a little.
Africa's native instruments, as well as its rhythm, has been used in many of today's music you would hear on the radio as well. For instance, one of the main exports out of Africa were mallet instruments, which you can hear in songs like Girls by the Beastie Boys, Firestone by Kygo, and Love My Way by the Psychedelic Furs. Another export was the horn, which can be heard in Safe and Sound by Capital Cities, September by Earth, Wind & Fire, and even the electronic hit Don't Let Me Down by the Chainsmokers. There's also call and response in songs such as Ain't It Fun by Paramore, Deja Vu by rapper Post Malone and Justin Bieber, and Mountain Sound by Of Monsters and Men. And these 9 songs didn't even begin to scratch the surface of the diverse catalog of music created with influence or instruments from Africa. The roots of African music has shaped our modern culture with its incredibly strong influence on today's music. From instruments to lyrics to singing styles, early Africa created a style that everyone is still using and replicating in their own music production. My name is Jack Milliken, and this has been Africa's influence on genres through the decades.